On this advanced tab, we can actually do a lot to really customize this game tree, much more so than we did here on this basic game tree builder. So you'll have the out of position and in position player, and the out of position player here is on the left, the in position player is on the right. We could get somewhat simple here, and without clicking on each of these individual custom settings, we can customize it to a certain degree and build the tree that way. So we can start by actually putting a default bet in. So in this case here, it's selected at 75% of the pots. I can choose really whatever I want here. So choose the option that makes sense for you in terms of modeling your own specific games. If the default bet is about half pot, then just put 50. If it's 2/3 pot, put 66. Whatever the case may be here, but your default bet is, I do like to fill this out here because as much as we customize these options down here, you're not going to cover every single portion of the game tree. So it's good to have a default bet just in case you haven't covered that specific scenario. The game tree is just going to automatically populate the default bet option for whatever it is that you don't actually cover in the rest of the options down here. This next option here is, with only 2 bets left, get the money in smoothly. What that just means here is when there's 2 bets left, it doesn't leave an awkward all-in bet. So suppose that there is 2 bets left and you have an option for betting pot, and on the next street you would try to be betting pot again, but there's only 1.2x pot left. Well, GTO Plus is going to be smart enough to realize that if there's only 1.2x pot left, it's not going to bet pot and then have a really, really small portion of the pot as a all-in bet on the river. It's going to kind of somewhat average those 2 bets out so that you might only have 45% pot here or 40% pot, and then you'll have another 45% pot on the river as a bet. So it gets it in smoothly, averages them out over those last 2 bets, as opposed to kind of leaving yourself with a really tiny bet on the last bet. There's this option here for the out of position player only as to don't donk unless you've shown aggression previously. You can select this if you want, and what this option here does is, in lines where there is a check bet call, so the out of position player check calls, the out of position player, if this is selected, will not have a donk bet on the next street. What this does actually mimic gameplays, because a lot of times you'll see scenarios where if someone is check calling, they're not necessarily going to be just open leading on the next street very often. It doesn't happen a ton. So this is an option here to actually just remove the option to donk out if the line getting to that street was check call. So unless you're actually the aggressor on the previous street, the out of position player here would not be leading out if you have this option selected. And then finally, this option here is, there's multiple options here, which is you can add an all-in if a push is less than a certain portion of the pot, or you can actually just say go all-in if a push is less than a certain portion of the pot. And this is exactly how it reads. If the push is less than, in this case here, 120% of the pot, what GTO Plus would do is it would add an additional option to just go all in this spot here. Whereas if, in this case here, if the push is less than 120% of the pot, it wouldn't even just add an additional option. The only option it would add would be to go all in if that was the case. Now, you can customize like this and build your tree, and GTO Plus would build a fine tree for you, but you can also customize at the individual street level. Each one of these streets is the same. So I'm only going to look at this at one street, and just know that anything I go through right here for the flop, for the out of position player and the in position player, they're both the same. And I'll just keep both of them open just so that you can see they're both the same. But they're also the same for the turn in the river. So I can customize this at every single individual street. So on the flop, I can go up to 6 individual bets, and I can denote here what sizing that I want to include. I can include one size, I can include multiple sizes. So if I want to include one size and I can add in a percent of the pot. So maybe I want to add 33% as the pot size. I can also do this by adding in notations of multiples of the previous bet. So for maybe check raise, I want to say check raise 3x. And what that would do is it would check raise, anytime it chose to check raise, it would check raise 3x the bet of the imposition player. There are other options when I get to turn, so you can actually see that when I hover over this, there's additional information. If I want to specify bets that are conditioned on things happening previously, I can put a specific sizing out for probes if the previous play was a check-check. I can put a specific sizing out for donks if the imposition player was the aggressor in the previous phase. Or I can put a specific sizing out for a c-bet if the out-of-position player was the aggressor on the previous phase. Or I can just ignore all of that and just put a number in, and that will be conditional based on all of these instances happening. This one is only the case. This only is relevant here for the turn and the river, because on the flop there is no such thing as a probe on the flop. There is no such thing as a donk on the flop or a c-bet on the flop as it relates to building game trees. It's specifically here too. So I can customize this to as much as I like. And again, if you go back to this tree builder tab here or the tree builder information on the GTO Plus website, they have all of this syntax here for what you might add. You could also even add geometric sizing in here too. So the geometric sizing here will let you bet based on a sizing to get the money in a certain number of bets, right? So GX here, as an example here, will create a geometrically sized bet corresponding to getting the money in X bets. So there's a lot of different ways in which you can actually customize this game tree. A few things to note here at the bottom is, one, whatever you customize, it's going to give you this memory that you actually need to solve the game tree itself. And I didn't cover this before, but here in this bottom left hand of the screen, you're going to see how much memory you actually have. And this is the RAM that you have within your PC. So if this memory ever gets to be above this value here, you're not going to have enough memory to be able to solve that tree. So you do have to actually have a sense for how much space or RAM you have on your PC and build the tree correspondingly. And if you only have a PC where maybe you only have like 8 gigs of RAM, you may not be able to actually build some complex trees, especially if you're adding multiple bets on earlier streets in the game tree. You can typically generally add as many bets as you want on rivers. Turns, for the most part, you can add a lot of different bets, but as you move closer and closer to the flop, the more complex or more bets that you add on flops, it's going to carry its way through the entire rest of the game tree, as we've demonstrated here in Module 1, that it's going to take a lot more memory to actually solve and a lot more processing power to actually solve. Now, from what you can see here, and we haven't really built out this tree that much, it's a lot. There's a lot of information here to build out game trees. That's why GTO Plus lets you save individual profiles. So you can actually save profiles. If you're comfortable with all of this, you might click Edit Profile. And if I actually choose the option that I have selected and I can click Add Current, I can actually save this profile as something else. I can also build or load a profile based on something that I've already previously saved. So I just happen to have already built out a 200 big blind game tree. If I want to load that 200 big blind game tree, as opposed to entering all of these values in again, I would just double click 200 big blind example. And what that would do here is that would load this entire 200 big blind game tree for me. And now you can see some of the options that I've actually added in. So I have a default bet of 2/3 pot. I say with only 2 bets left, get the money in smoothly. I do like to add that functionality. I have an add all in if a push is less than 200% pot. So if either player has the option, if either player is, the SPR is less than 2 for either player at any given street, I'm going to add an additional option in this game tree to go all in. I still want to include all of the other options that I've included here in the game tree, which I'll make sure I do so, but I also want the option to just shove all in if that is the case that we find ourselves in. For the out of position player, I have given the out of position player only one bet size on the flop. So I've given the out of position player an option to bet half pot on the flop if he or she chooses to bet. And I like to do that a lot of the cases here, especially when the out of position player is not the aggressor pre-flop, because the out of position player is not going to be leading that often. In most cases, or in a lot of situations, you might see the out of position player just by default check all of his or her range against an in position aggressor. But I do like to give the out of position player one option to lead into the in position player, and I tend to just throw a half pot sizing into there. But you can choose really whatever sizing that you want, and you can choose multiple sizings if you wanted to in this case here too. When the out of position player checks, I gave the out of position player an option to check raise to 3.5x the size of the in position player's bet. For the in position player, I've given the in position player an option of raising 3.25x if the out of position player bets, and if the out of position player checks, I give the option to bet 1/3 pot or 2/3 pot, so a small sizing or a large sizing here too. On turns and rivers, I mirror for the out of position player. So for the out of position player, I give him or her an option to bet either half pot or full pot. And then check raises are for 3.25x. Whereas the in position player, I give the option to bet 3 bet sizes, a 40% sizing, an 80% sizing, or a 120% sizing. And then a check raise would be to 3x. Typically, I like to keep my sizings when I do 3 or more sizings. I like to space them out linearly, mainly because I want to see if the solver really chooses one or the other. A lot of times if you cluster some of them together, you're not necessarily going to see that distribution that you would want to see. And it's going to be harder to draw some conclusions as to when looking at the outputs and how the solver distributes combinations or hands amongst those various options. So I do like to keep it somewhat kind of linear and spaced evenly when I'm choosing to give it options like that. The final thing, which I haven't necessarily covered here yet, is there's triangles next to each of these. And I can actually click on these triangles, and it's going to give me a few more options, and it mirrors these default settings above. So you'll notice here that I actually have not included any sizings for 3 bets or 4 bets or 5 bets or 6 bets, and that's by design here. And essentially because when I get to that point, it happens so infrequently, I don't necessarily think you need to be as specific or precise unless you're specifically studying that. But 2, I don't necessarily think it's necessary to fill out all of these, mainly for that reason. You don't necessarily have to be so precise if you're not necessarily studying those particular portions of the game tree. So this default bet will account for any one of these areas that I haven't filled any values in for. I also include here for flops and turns the same functionality that I have up at the top here. So 2 bets left, get the money in smoothly, add all in if the push is less than 200% pot. If I didn't select these here, I would just kind of default to the overall settings here. But if I chose something different here, so maybe I wanted to add something specific here for the flop and add an all in if there was a push less than 150% of the pot, right? Maybe I didn't want them to go all in at 200% of the pot. I can override everything up here by being more specific here in this particular portion. So in essence, when GTO Plus is building out this game tree, it's going to choose the level of specificity first. And if the specificity isn't there, so for instance, I don't have a specific value here for the 33% for the 3 bet, I don't have a specific value here for the 4 bet, etc. It's going to default based off of the next level up. In this case here, it's based off of what I've actually selected here at 66% pot. If this was blank, it would then go one more level up and default at the overarching default settings for the entire game tree. When I feel comfortable with this whole game tree, again, I can see this sizing. Now I have 7.6 gigs required. If I check over here at my own PC, I have a lot of RAM in my PC, so I am not hurting on space to actually solve this game tree, and I know that's here, so I'm comfortable that I have enough memory to solve this game tree, and I can click build tree. And since I already have one loaded, it's going to tell me that this is going to delete the previous one. And it's nice that GTO Plus does this and it doesn't just automatically overwrite my tree. But now I can actually click build tree and it will overwrite the tree and build the tree based on this specific settings. So before I actually run the solver, the last thing I can actually do is navigate through this game tree just to make sure that it's set up the way in which I want it to be set up. If I hover over each of these individual bets, it's actually going to show me what percentage of the pot, so I can actually mirror it against the options that I've selected. And GTO Plus is not going to be 100% precise here, so in this case, I gave it the option, the out of position player, the option to bet 50% pot. Well, it wrote a game tree node for the out of position player to bet 3.2 in this case, which is 49.2% of the pot, which is in this case close enough here. As I navigate through, I can see that the in position player, I gave it a small bet sizing of 1/3 pot, which is this bet 2.15, and a large bet sizing of 2/3 pot, which is this bet 4.3. So I can continue navigating through this game tree and see various options that I have selected for this here too. So again, I can continue navigating through. You can also see that as I click through these, GTO Plus by default, before solving this, will just allocate each individual combination evenly across all strategic options. And again, that's how it starts. That's the initial baseline before I actually run the solver. But when we actually run the solver, the output is going to be, these values are going to be varied. So when I'm happy with my game tree, and I'm happy that my game tree is built to the specifications that I want, and we've already clicked build tree and we've done so, I would go over here to this final option before running the solver to actually run the solver. And I can do a few different things here when I want to run the solver. I can do this at the basic mode, and that's what we're going to go through right now, or the advanced mode. And we'll go through the advanced mode, which is the database mode, in a subsequent video. But in the basic mode here, I'm going to actually just solve this one tree. This target deviation here is how far away from equilibrium am I comfortable with this solution. There's a few options here, and I think by default GTO Plus will select this 0.5%. There's also an option for 0.25% or 0.1%, and really what that means is that neither player at the solution will be able to have a counter exploit that exploits either player by more than that percentage of the pot. I tend to actually use 1% by default here a lot here. And I've gone through the reasons why of that in the first module. Because we're very fallible in our inputs, we're already introducing some type of margin of error. So in my opinion, 1% margin of error here in an output solution is not going to be that big of a difference than 0.5% margin of error or 0.25% margin of error. We're just not that precise that 0.5% is going to make a huge difference. So if that's going to help me complete a solve a minute faster, 2 minutes faster, 3 minutes faster, or maybe even more, then I'm comfortable with prioritizing speed over accuracy in this case here. We can choose how many threads that we actually, so if you have if you have a CPU that has a lot of processing power or has a lot of threads or cores, you can choose how many threads that you actually want to utilize here. I'm choosing to use 32 to actually run this solve. And then you have this other option, which is you can choose basic storage or extensive storage. So basic storage is only going to calculate the flop, and then it's going to have to recalculate turns and rivers every single time that you open up and you want to navigate the turns and rivers. Fine option, because GTO Plus has the option to be able to recalculate things fairly easily. The only thing to note though here is that it's going to take a little bit of time to recalculate those, and that might change some of the values within the solution. But especially if you're trying to share files, if you want to compress space on your computer, that this is a really good option to save files in a more compressed format. There's also this extensive storage where the turn data is fully stored and does not require recalculation. The river data still will require recalculation here, but by storing the turn data, you can see here that our storage goes up to 86 megabytes, whereas if we don't store the turn data, we only have 1 megabyte worth of data here too. So you can do so based off of whatever you actually want to select. But I'm going to choose extensive storage, and I can click Run Solver, and it's going to start the solver. And that's where we're going to wrap up this video and move on to the next video, where we're going to look at the output of this solution. And I'm going to walk through what this output looks like and how GTO Plus visualizes some of the output and the options for navigating around the output of the game tree. So I'll see you in that next video.